Here, the Russians reportedly advanced according to the Institute for the Study of War. The Institute for the Study of War and AFP also say so. It would be an unprecedented advance in the past year. Does that match your observations?
It's been over a year, since late 2022, since we've seen movement at this level. On the Russian side, Ukrainians had taken 1,200 square kilometers in the Kursk region within a few weeks. The Russians hadn't managed to make such a significant advance since the end of 2022. So here we're really looking at possibly the return of maneuver warfare, but it shouldn't be considered something that's firmly established today. The Russians managed, and this was when I was still there at the end of last week, to reach the main defensive line at a very specific point on the front, because you have to understand that the front is no longer organized like it was in the past. We're used to having trenches, and when we look at the war of 1914 to 1918 and how the war was up until 2023-2024 in Ukraine, it was all about long trenches. But that's not suitable for dealing with drones. It's good against artillery. And so Ukraine, like Russia actually, has small hideouts where the men are, and there's no continuity. And the Russians managed to infiltrate between two of these passages.
Explain to us. With the map in hand here, we have the map in front of us. It's here. I don't know if you can see it, but in any case, we can actually see Pokrovsk, Chasivia, Kramatorsk is a bit higher up. So what's the logic?
The Pokrovsk area, so there was really this front that was held by the 155th Brigade and of Kyiv, the one that was formed and equipped by France. When the Ukrainians are properly equipped, they hold the front. And since last January, with the Ukrainians of the 155th present there, they've completely held the front. But just in the east, it was a brigade that was rather equipped in the Soviet way, and little by little it got outflanked, it got worn down. This area of Pokrovsk was so well held by the French brigade that over time it ended up in a kind of pocket. And deep in this Russian advance, which was moving forward gradually, at the end of last week they reached the main defensive line and they managed to advance to break through. These are small infiltration groups. I have information on that. They put on some kind of refrigerated ponchos that allow them to move around at night without being seen, even with thermal and infrared cameras on the drones. And in this way, they managed to infiltrate, to get behind the lines, to sabotage 23 areas to set traps and ambushes for the Ukrainians, and also to kill civilians so as not to leave any witnesses. And then behind them, they brought other men along the same line. But we're talking about very small infiltration groups. No exploitation occurred, no trenches were dug, and no divisions or armored vehicles moved through this area. Obviously, the problem for the Ukrainians is that they now have men behind them, Russians behind them. The real question, and this is crucial, in the next 40 hours is whether the Russians will manage to exploit this breach or whether the Ukrainians will push them back.
Explain to us. These images show Ukraine eliminating a Russian assault group attempting to break through Ukrainian defenses near Pokrovsk. These images are really important because they're not just illustrative images, they're real images from the front, as it's happening or as it happened a few hours ago.
So, Pokrov, you have to understand the main line that's being held is there. A third of all Russian assaults across the entire front have been concentrated in the Pokrov area for a year. A city expected to fall a year ago is still holding on.
Which puts the Russian advance in perspective.
Of course, it's still totally minimal, but in the long run, at the current pace, by the end of the year, the Ukrainians will have to withdraw from Pokrov. But if indeed these small groups aren't really assault groups, they're infiltration teams, as discreet as possible, moving forward in small groups and not attacking with mopeds, scooters, and quads, as we've seen many times, they're on foot. The goal is to be as stealthy as possible.
What we see exactly here, we see a vehicle that is hit by a drone or by a missile.
It's usually drones in general, so here we saw a Russian infiltration group that was about to launch an assault, which was hit, and we see these groups getting out and continuing to move forward, but traditionally when we see explosions on Russian vehicles, we usually see people running away in all directions as fast as possible. Here they stay together as a group, 4 or 5 people, spaced out so that a drone can't kill everyone at once. So we can see that these are trained soldiers, they're professionals, so these troops are clearly well-trained. By looking at this, we can tell these aren't the typical Russians we see daily. Remember, this is only from open sources. Open source analysts like Andrew Perpetua and his team can verify more than 100 Russian deaths a day from imagery. We're used to seeing how the Russians react under bombardment, but these guys are professionals.
This tradition isn't just Russian. Going behind enemy lines happened often in World War II and elsewhere. Or the Russian sabotage groups, including special services, the secret police, going behind enemy lines.
Tradition. But the goal, generally speaking, is to be able to sabotage deep behind the lines. Now, the Ukrainians are telling me another thing, that they, the Ukrainians, are now experiencing what they used to do to the Russians for more than 6 months. The Ukrainians had an advantage with more drones, allowing them to strike deep into Russian territory. Now, Ukrainian forces also have drones behind them reaching 3, 5, or 10 kilometers. It's getting harder, but we have an exact map and we'll return to it. But it's becoming more and more difficult for the Ukrainians simply to supply the very front line, those who hold the positions closest to the Russians. They can no longer supply them with quads or anything else, so they have to resupply them by drone to bring them food. And before, that wasn't the case for the Ukrainians. The Russians were the ones experiencing that. Now the Ukrainians are experiencing it too. The suffering at the very front line is really shared by both sides. And if we focus on this map, we can clearly see it. How did the Russians manage to make progress specifically, and now they are targeting Dobropyle? And when you have this city of Pokrovsk, and therefore the southern area of Pokrovsk, which is here and is being held, once again, the Russians haven't advanced a single meter in this area because it is controlled by teams trained and equipped by France. Whereas in the north, you have brigades that are less well-trained, less well-equipped, but in equal numbers, once again, and that have managed to make progress. And here the question is, in 3 days, have we seen small groups of Russians manage to advance by 7 kilometers? And if they manage to reinforce these groups, and if they really manage to build defenses to bring artillery into this area, there potentially the Russians could really seal off Pokrovsk.
Next, we see this kind of pincer movement. If this kind of pincer movement we see here were to close, what road would that lead to?
So there, it's the road behind. No, it's where we're heading. So why?
It's a tactical role, let's say.
We're holding a city, and cities are like fortresses. Pokrovsk is a city that has held out for a year, and if there were no city, the Russians would advance field by field, and they would make progress little by little, little by little.
Watch the next sequence. It's very interesting. In this case, this time it's the Ukrainians who are advancing. It's the 3rd Assault Brigade. That must mean something to you, and you'll comment soon, but let's listen first because it's interesting. We can see how tree line by tree line they're advancing, and how now the support is also more sophisticated on both sides. It's very technical support. We're no longer just in the First World War. Look.
Come on, guys. Put the wing over there and let's keep going. Wake up.
He's a technician. We're not in the same situation anymore. Do you see what I told you? It's technical.
We are...
This support
no longer in the...
is a very technical support.
We
I don't see... He's a technician. He's no longer in there.
We got him. Yeah. Either you or you, the 12. I don't know. That's it. Yeah, I mean, there's one over there.
the first little trophy.
check all the enemies on our radio. I'll check. Merci.
There's a radio. Yes, that's a plus, a plus.
Guys, good job, all of you. Now monitor the radio and get information from it.
You said, Titleman, there are a lot of instructions there. What strikes me is how much. Now, for example, even just with cell phones, they work between the support operator, the support teams, and the shooters.
Yes, so they have apps, especially one called Kropiva, which is very well known now. It's a kind of digital battlefield of the area they are going to attack. That means the Ukrainians, they have their app, which can be on a phone. It's a regular phone, except it's disconnected from the internet, except for what they call the mesh, which means the phones will communicate with each other without needing to transmit by radio. They'll be able to relay like that from one to another until they're able to communicate all the way back to their base, which is in the rear. And so they have their app that tells them exactly where the enemies are, how they've moved, how many there are in each hideout, including thanks to infrared cameras that allow them to measure the heat coming from a bunker. So they know there are 2 or 3 guys inside, and it's very, very precise. And so when they move forward, they're going to start getting closer. But here we're talking about a specific brigade, the 3rd Assault Brigade. I had the chance to spend a little time with them. These are people who aren't there to hold the lines. They're the ones who launch assaults, taking trenches. 95% of assaults are carried out by the Russians. So here these are very special units, the Ukrainians, who are actually going on the attack. That's still pretty rare. So these are elite units that have a lot more resources and are highly, highly trained. There's a tough selection process to get in, and they're really shock troops. And so their objective is to reach enemy troops and manage to recover radios. And that's when they say, listen to the radio. If you manage to recover a radio, it means it's potentially not encrypted, or that they'll be able to listen to it. And then gather intelligence, so the goal is to gather intelligence and sabotage behind enemy lines. Exactly what the Russians are doing in the Pokrovsk area, the Ukrainians of the 3rd Assault Brigade are doing on the Lyman side.
Let's look at these other images. It's the same 3rd Assault Brigade, and it matches exactly what you're saying. They're clearing out villages again, staying on the offensive and moving from one village to the next. They make sure that we'll show the images and you'll comment on them at the same time. They make sure we'll have them a little later in the show. That they're really able to make progress, even from one tree line to the next.
That's what they call their Passade K, but it's become the tree lines, they call that the K Passade. And holding your tree line, it's almost become a joke among the Ukrainians. They wear patches saying, "You won't take my Passade K," feeling like they're fighting only for a tree line. Each time they hold the line, it stops the Russians from advancing 100 meters. It's a slow, gradual process of wearing them down. For the Ukrainians, their goal and their fear is that the Russians might locally manage to send more men than they have kamikaze drones to stop them. So locally, when you have 50 or 60 Russians attacking and the Ukrainians only have 200 kamikaze drones, only 1 out of 3 actually hits the target. Well, sometimes you have 10 or 15 Russians who manage to make it through the assault to the K passage and then to the trench and the tree line held by the Ukrainians. And that's how they make progress, taking risks.
If we weigh everything we're seeing here, we can see that the Ukrainians in some places are making progress, and even in a sophisticated way. And then, on the other hand, especially in the city of Pokrovsk, which is being encircled more and more tightly by the Russians, what is the situation? Review the images of Toretsk. It's among those cities that have been...
I was there in April.
...destroyed, like Mariupol, Bakhmut, etc. The images are really quite terrifying when you see them. Is that, for example, the fate reserved for Pokrovsk, which is being taken?
But of course, then, all the cities, without exception, are razed, destroyed, and their population is forced to leave. I was in Sivers, actually a bit further north. You can see those cities in the distance, along with the explosions and bombings. There are no military targets there. That is to say, now it's just soldiers protecting this city with a few dozen residents who still live there. I was shocked in Sivers, because the people who stay are those who don't want to abandon their pets. They stay put. Everyone else has left. I have 15 dogs and 20 cats that I have to take care of. If I leave, they'll all die, so I stay here to take care of the animals. So the Ukrainians are actually defending fields of ruins, but the problem is that if they abandon these ruins, tomorrow the Russians will attack Kramatorsk, they'll attack the next city, they'll create more fields of ruins, and that's what people need to understand. When Ukrainians say they'll lose 100, 200, or 500 lives, they mean retreating would lead to thousands of deaths in the city, including civilians behind them. So when they're defending fields of ruins, it's actually to prevent more civilian deaths, and it's estimated that there are around 200,000 civilian deaths now in the occupied areas. So this morning, we have a bit more consolidated information about the real situation in the Dobropile area, north of Pokrovsk. And apparently it was just infiltration groups. That means the Russians actually sent relatively experienced men, some of them very young as 20 years old, at least among those who were captured. And their objective was to go and plant a flag as far north as possible. It was 100% a PR operation by Russia. And indeed, they would have liked to take advantage of this small advance, but they didn't do it. They weren't able to do it. And the fact that the Ukrainians are sending shock troops, especially Azov's 12th unit. So we're talking about assault troops who are relatively experienced, who have been on the ground. We also have the drone operators who saw the situation, who were able to operate, including with the support of local civilians who guided them for certain operations. We have interesting videos of retirees claiming Russians are hiding in this house, so our information is becoming more precise. And so the Russians weren't able to take advantage of this advance. But the question is, did they really want to do it? given that we didn't even see a mechanized assault or any attempt on their part that was stopped by the Ukrainians. Typically, when Ukrainians encounter a mechanized assault, they share images of it. So here we do have these infiltration groups. We have the destruction of some of these infiltration groups, but we don't see any attempt to support these infiltration groups with a real advance. So after that, the maps were getting ahead of themselves, claiming there were advances of 7 kilometers. Well, yes, there were Russians who advanced 7 kilometers. They were completely scattered, isolated, supplied only by drones, so they were really just lightly equipped groups. But they are. It was an attempt to make a case, like 2 days before the meeting between Trump and Putin. And really, on the informational level, it's a success. The Russians managed to claim that they had made a lot of progress, while in reality, it was just a small group that managed to plant a flag relatively far north, and there will be no consequences. And so these groups are being destroyed one after another, and we even have maps that show the front has flattened out again, just like it was in the past, and that the groups that were in the north would now be completely isolated, with no possibility of escaping now. But in any case, it also means that the Russians have learned and adopted the Ukrainian methods of infiltration. Let me remind you, for example, about Frank, the sniper you know from the channel. He also had his thermal camouflage blankets. I didn't talk about it because I didn't know if the Russians had copied those methods or if they knew about them. So thermal camouflage blankets are a Ukrainian infiltration method that has been well established and used for over a year. Now the Russians are also using them to hide from drones. That's something indeed we can reveal. But the fact that the Russians are adopting the good Ukrainian methods to try to advance in this way means that the Ukrainians can no longer afford to hold a front line with just small, isolated hideouts. We also need to go back to a method of monitoring the situation where there might be sensors, maybe cameras, maybe some kind of radars. Because we have radars, including in the French army, that can detect groups moving around. So Ukrainians also need to ask themselves this question and apply strong corrective measures, since it's the Ukrainians who are facing 95% of the assault attempts along the entire front. For Ukrainians, attempts to advance and launch small assaults, as we saw in the video with the 3rd Assault Brigade, are rare. But overall, the Ukrainians need to consolidate their rear positions and regroup. A line that may not be right on the front line, but one further back. This would help them be more secure against these infiltration groups we've seen repeatedly. But in any case, the situation remains difficult, and the Pokrovsk area is still under pressure, under heavy pressure. That small salient was just for show, apparently in the south. Still, we need to see if the Ukrainians have actually managed to close the pocket, or if there's still a small advance. In that case, it still needs to be addressed. But overall, there's not the same concern today that we had 2 days ago. There won't be any exploitation of this breach and therefore no accelerated retreat. But I stand by my position. Pokrovsk, which the Ukrainians will certainly have to retreat from. Pokrovsk. If the Russians continue to advance at the current pace by the end of the year, by November or December, at the current pace, the Ukrainians will have to leave and abandon the city, which is already in ruins, remember. Just like they had to do in Vuhledar, after many frontal assaults on Vuhledar, which the Russians failed to take. It was simply by gradually encroaching on the area around Vuhledar that the Ukrainians had to leave. So, unfortunately, maybe we'll see that by the end of the year in Pokrovsk. And if there are other breaches, breakthroughs, then obviously things could go much faster. But overall, the front continues to move relatively slowly. And that means that for Donbass, for Donetsk, it will still take between 2.5 and 3 years for the Russians to conquer everything they still haven't captured in the Donbass. And there, very clearly, it's very unlikely. And I also remind you of previous cases, whether in Korea or in Vietnam. Just before the ceasefire, well, 2 or 3 weeks before, there were these kinds of assaults. Kind of for show, and so maybe that's something we're seeing here as well. Hope you enjoyed it. See you soon. We'll discuss more topics beyond Ukraine, but we'll continue to follow events there.